Thank you very much for the invitation and for the very kind introduction. So I think there are some members in the audience old enough to remember when all my work was on color vision and its neural computational implementations. So it's a long stretch from looking at mechanisms of vision to talking about the mind of an insect. So I guess I owe you a bit of an explanation for how I get there. And so those of you who've seen yesterday's talk will realize that I like to speculate, that I like to probe difficult territory. And so while we don't actually have, no more or no less than many other animals, formal evidence for a form of consciousness in bees' heads, I'd like to explore in that direction. And so what I'd like to ask today is whether there's at least suggestive evidence to indicate that bees have mental representations of things and of space and of things in space and of number. I want to explore the extent to which they have flexible access to past experiences and some form of planning for the future. Perhaps more controversially, I want to ask if bees could be said to have emotion-like states. And we'll see that at a computational level, many things that appear very intelligent are actually can actually be underpinned with fairly minimal circuitry and are thus perhaps quite simple to evolve. Now, the exploration of whether and by what pathways insects do complex things has a long history. And I think we're all aware that insects can sometimes do impressive things. So here's an example of the famous La Sagrada Familia in Barcelona on the right, and on the left-hand side, a structure that looks, at least if you divide out the scale factors, superficially similar at a termite hill. And while there's some external similarity there, common thinking is that these structures come about by entirely different pathways in the human case and in the insect case on the other hand. In humans, we have an architect who devises a plan and then hands down instructions to builders and engineers and so on, who then put the architect's vision into reality. Whereas, so common thinking goes, in the insect case, these structures are entirely the result of emergent properties of lots of robotically behaving little machines that know by innate rules what they are to do, and then somehow as a bottom-up strategy of these lots of tiny robots, these magnificent structures arise. And this dichotomy, this perceived dichotomy, is something that I want to deconstruct a little bit today. Now, the exploration of the question of consciousness in insects is older than many people realize. There was a vibrant debate around the turn of the 19th to the 20th century about this very topic. But even earlier than that, there are hints of people considering such questions. So Charles Bonnet, a French naturalist, in a sense here considered the question of bottom-up strategies in insect architectural construction. And he was fascinated, like many scholars historically, with honeycomb, because it's really a mathematically optimal or close to optimal structure. It's unique across the animal kingdom and in terms of its symmetry, its functionality, the way in which it minimizes building material while maximizing stability and storage space. Is also double-sided, so there are two sides to this that are directly interfaced. And Charles Bonnet said the following about how this structure comes about. Placed together in the same room 10,000 automatons animated with a living force and all induced through the perfect resemblance of their outer and inner being. If we admit the least degree of feeling in these automatons, even only such as is necessary for them to be conscious of their own existence, seek their own conservation, avoid noxious things, prepare useful things, etc., their work will not only be regular, well-proportioned, similar, equal, but it will also have symmetry, strength, convenience to the highest point of perfection. Now, this is a curious blend of a bottom-up kind of view, where he says you can put all of these automatons together in a common space, and then somehow these structures will magically arise. But on the other hand, he seems to take it for granted that they have feelings. He talks of a match between their inner and outer being, which is very much how we view some aspects of consciousness today. So it's a blend of both perspectives. But the first person to explore experimentally how these kinds of structures come about was François Hubert and his team. And you can see here in this image that the construction of honeycomb usually starts at the ceiling of the cavity that is the hive or the natural nest, and then proceeds downward using gravity as a directional reference until they've reached somewhere near the bottom. And because Hubert and his team were interested in how this process actually happens inside the colony, they experimented with hives that had glass walls, or in the first instance, a glass ceiling, just to see what happens inside. And the first thing that Hubert and his team realized was that the bees didn't like very much to attach the foundations of their comb to a slippery surface that is glass, if it's put in as the ceiling. What did the bees do? They inverted the entire routine, starting at the bottom and building gradually upwards, like a tower construction. And you might say, well, this is still a repetitive robotic process, but the point there is, had you built a machine to simply mimic the natural procedure, start at the top, use gravity as a reference, build down, that machine would already fall flat on its face with this simple challenge, unless you give it the desired end state of the construction. Now, in the next step, Hubert and his team decided to make this a little harder for the bees and said, okay, what happens if we now insert both a glass floor and a glass ceiling? All right, said the bees, started the foundations on one of the side walls and built the construction laterally through the cavity until they arrived on the opposite wall. So another degree of freedom in terms of the flexibility there. But the most remarkable thing happened when, after this construction had begun, so the bees had started from one of the side walls, as you can see in panel A, to build in the direction of the opposite wall. After this construction had begun, the team then inserted an obstacle into the path of the ongoing construction. So it's normally a two-dimensional sheet, and so you can predict where ultimately the construction will arrive a few days later. And in this case, the obstacle was, again, a glass wall on the target wall, as you can see in panel B. Now, you might imagine what bees might do in that case is just continue pottering away, going and building until they reach that suboptimal target wall, then perhaps realize, okay, this is unstable, let's build some extra fortifications. But that's not what happened. So days before they reached that possible future outcome, the bees amended their construction and built a curve into it, basically a 90-degree angle, and attached the construction to the nearest wood wall. And the point there is that this amendment, this correction of the construction, happened days in advance of the future suboptimal outcome. And Hubert at the time exclaimed 2 centuries ago that I acknowledge that I could not suppress a sentiment of admiration for an action in which the brightest foresight was displayed. Now, these are historical experiments. They await replication with modern sample sizes and an exploration of which individuals do what in this kind of construction process. But in terms of probing an animal's flexibility in a process that is generally considered as hardwired, these experiments were very visionary. Now, most of the explorations of learning behavior and cognition we nowadays do is in the context of flower visitation of bees. And the first thing you realize in the interaction between bees and flowers is, of course, that their perceptual world, their vision, is in many ways very much unlike ours. So you can see here that bees, of course, have UV sensitivity, which allows them to see bicolored patterns in many cases where we just see a single color. And that, of course, is a healthy reminder that the world we see is not the real or the comprehensive physical world, but that the world that we perceive and bees perceive is filtered through the particular sense organs that they have acquired during evolution. The other important point, just to repeat something from yesterday, of course, is that bees need to be careful shoppers in the flower supermarket. That is, in the flight range of any one bee nest or hive, there might be dozens of different plant species, all differing in the quality of their rewards, the concentration and volume of nectar, but also in the signals that advertise these rewards. And of course, you have to, as a generalist pollinator, remember the patterns, the colors, the scents of these flowers that get you to the reward. And in a sense, we merely exploit bees' flexibility in associating almost anything with sugar rewards. This was a somewhat tongue-in-cheek experiment where we trained bees to land on a little platform with a drop of sugar water. Here's a bee about to land in front of an image of a human face. And we do that a few times. Then we shuffle the spatial positions of the faces. We remove the rewards. We remove all scent marks and then ask, can you now find the correct face that you've previously been receiving a reward on? And indeed, it turns out that bees are pretty good, about 80% with pairs of faces that are actually quite similar. Now, this doesn't mean at all that they recognize these things at faces. To a bee, to my mind, this is simply a strange flower. But the point there is that this is, while it's basically similar to a crime witness test in the human realm, they're actually quite good at recognizing these strange patterns. And that, of course, there is flexibility beyond just flower patterns. Now, just as a little side note, my work is entirely curiosity motivated. I have no ambition to do anything useful for industry, let alone the military. But within about a week of us publishing this work, I had this sinister guy from the US Air Force in my office. This was the early 2000s, and the military was then inundated with funding to hunt the perpetrators of 9/11 and so on. And so this guy thought that we might be able to leverage the principles of insect face recognition and their computational underpinnings for all kinds of sinister plans to hunt down people. I gave him a very short answer, but it was curious just how quickly they responded to this publication. We'll come back later to the question of whether this is actually remarkable that bees can recognize faces in neurocomputational terms. Little hint, it's not. One of the other things that bees need to be good at, of course, is navigation over long distances. So honeybees, for example, will fly over 10 kilometers away from their hive and reliably find their way back in excursions that often take several hours. And we use this equipment called harmonic radar, where the bottom dish emits a signal that's transponded, so bees can't carry anything battery powered. So this is a transponder that bounces back a signal at a different frequency, which is then picked up by this top dish. And of course, the spatial challenges faced by bees when navigating over many miles or kilometers between a nest and a target these challenges are not to be underestimated. So you can perhaps barely make out, this is a landscape near my second home in Mexico, a tree here with a bee nest, and you might find your good nectar source behind this little hillock over there, and a good pollen source over here. There are thousands of trees, all with similar shapes in this environment. You need to find that one tree that contains your nest. There are also dozens of hill shapes that all look similar. So this is not a trivial challenge. I don't know if any of you do wild nature hiking without the assistance of any kind of technology or maps. It's not generally recommended. It's something I sort of do as a hobby, but it can easily go wrong, especially if you're down among the trees. But so it's especially not a trivial challenge with a brain the size of a pinhead. So what we can do with our radar technology is not just, of course, to know where the bee is while she's exploring or navigating her environment, but ultimately with our 3D tracking technology, we also hope to reconstruct the views from the cockpit of the bee. That is, if we know exactly where the bee is and which direction it's flying, and we can reconstruct how the world looks from inside the bee's head. And this is what we're seeing here with the orientation flight of a honeybee drone. So this is a male honeybee, and you can see these boomerang-shaped structures, which essentially are the views through a bee's eye. And you can see that they're very coarse-grained in terms of pixelation, so visual spatial resolution is much worse in bees than in ours. On the other hand, they can process more information per unit time. So by little side-to-side scanning movements, they can actually improve their spatial detail quite a bit. Now, the idea of cognitive mapping is quite a bit older than most people realize. It was first suggested by Margaret Washburn, who was one of the founding mothers, in this case, of the exploration of comparative cognition and consciousness, with a book in 1908, in which she referenced quite a bit of insect work. And she suggested that, if, in this case, a wasp flies past 3 landmarks, A, B, and C, and if these landmarks had impressed themselves upon the wasp's consciousness. Now, if on the return trip, the wasp can have in mind not only C, which is actually in front of her, but also the memory of B and A and of their relative position, she can greatly shorten her course by flying straight from C to A. So this is the classic example of flying a novel shortcut from memorizing positions A, B, and C if you actually know the relative positions to each other. And she points out quite correctly that the wasp does not need to wait for the complete repetition of a series of stimuli even once. For the earlier members of the series being given, the later ones are suggested in idea. And so we explore the insects' navigation, not wasps, but bumblebees in this case, using harmonic radar. In this case, in a version of the traveling salesman problem. So here's a hive or a nest and 5 different locations distributed in this particular study in this array. And you can see a clearly suboptimal path linking these 5 stations. Why is this a traveling salesman problem? The idea is that in the bee's case, just as in the human realm, you need to find the optimum route to minimize travel distance and energy expenditure, very much like a salesperson does when they want to link 5 locations in the course of the day, let's say in the Rhine area, for example. And you can see that this path is clearly still suboptimal. All these paths that you're about to see are green. Green means early, yellow, orange in the middle, and red is later in the path. But of course, to start with, bees don't have a map yet. They have to explore where everything is and build up a representation over time. And what you're seeing on the right are multiple dozen sequential bouts of the same individual gradually acquiring knowledge of this area. So she's now found all 5 locations. You can see there's still quite a bit of exploration outside the array, but the path we're now to bout flight number 20, ever more streamlined until indeed the bee finds the optimum path and then sticks with it with minimal further exploration. And in some other studies, we were actually interested in what bees might do when they're entirely left to their own devices. We're not setting any challenges by means of artificial feeding stations. We're just leaving them to explore the world around them and forage as they see fit from the available food sources. And what we're seeing in this simulation, this is an orientation flight, the maiden flight, the very first flight that this individual leaves her native nest and explores her environment. This is sped up 130 times. The real flight is over 2 hours, and we don't have time for that, I guess, although I love to watch these things in real time as well. But what you can see, so this is all one flight, right? So the bee explores in various directions, always returning to the vicinity of the hive, then exploring in a new loop in a different direction. And over 2 hours later enters the nest again. And what will become of interest a bit later is that during this course, there is an exploration of this forest edge up here. So just bear that in the back of your minds or in your working memories for the time being. Here's the next day. So the bee, again, green is early, yellow, orange in the middle, red is later. So we're following that one individual. So we have a very individual-based focus in these investigations, unlike perhaps the Drosophila people who often look at crowd behavior. So we follow that one individual for all of its life, and that bee makes one more exploratory loop on the next day in a southwesterly direction. And now she's discovered something. She's discovered a good foraging patch up here near that forest edge, and then focuses all her foraging efforts on just that one patch, like an assembly line worker going back and forth and back and forth. No further exploration of alternatives, just exploiting that particular now familiar patch. Then the bee was stuck at home for a few days because it was raining. And then she came out again green is early here, made a few more flights to that familiar patch, which it seems perhaps was now less profitable, because on one of these outbound flights, she appeared to change her mind halfway on the flight towards that direction, and then ended up over here at a location that bee had only explored during her very first flight ever, 10 days earlier. Okay? And she crucially did so in line with Washburn's idea, without retracing her steps from A to B to C, but flying there directly. So this is not an experiment probing cognitive maps. This is just, in a sense, an entirely observational study, because the bee can do what it wants, but it's at least suggestive of some sort of mental representation of space around her. Of course, there are plenty of beautiful experimental explorations of cognitive maps by Randolph, Menzel, and others. Now, one of the first study I ever did on bee orientation was a somewhat bizarre project where, with a few other PhD students, we wondered if bees could count landmarks. And so we erected these tetrahedral 3.5 meter high tents in the landscape and let bees fly along a trajectory from the hive that was over here, along 3 landmarks, and collect food over here. And after the bees had shuttled back and forth a few times, we then produced contradictions between the memorized number of landmarks and the correct, or the memorized distance, so that over the same distance there were now either more landmarks or fewer. And it turned out that the more landmarks there were, the earlier the bees as a group tended to land. If we reduced the number of landmarks, the bees tended to overshoot the target and fly further than they had previously. And this was actually the first time that I got some press coverage for an article. So this was, I don't know how many of you know Dave Barry. He's a very funny person who writes for the Washington Post, and he wrote the following about our article. The article states that these scientists, whose names are Lars and Carl, set up various landmarks between a beehive and a bee feeder. After the bees had located the feeder, Lars and Carl started changing the location of the feeder and landmarks. The surprising result, Lars and Carl were both killed by eyeball stings. No, seriously, they discovered that the bees were locating the feeder by counting the landmarks. Yes, bees can count. This means that bees, in terms of math skills, are ahead of most American high school graduates. This is an American writing this, so I feel entitled to quote him on that. But the question, of course, then is, as anything in comparative cognition, it looks clever. How clever actually is it in neural computational terms? And of course, these results, while I think no one quite believed them at the time, have now been replicated by many labs independently. Here's one other version of this kind of counting task. Here's a very simple discrimination of 2 versus 4, where we sequentially train the bee through various arrangement of 2 dotted versus 4 dotted patterns. Always, in this case, the bee, I think in this group, the bees are trained to 2, and they have to extract the correct number despite the arrangement, and the types of countable items always change, and they're matched, of course, for size and so on. And we then present bees with new objects in new arrangements and ask, can they still find the correct number, and also whether, in case we give them entirely new targets, such as these purple arrangements, can they still find the correct number. And here's a little video of such an experiment, so you can see that there are now various patterns. The spatial positions of them are always changed. And the bee here is trained to 2, and you can see that there are various 4s. And of course, to distinguish 4 from 2, you only need to take off 3 items before deciding, well, that can't be a 2. And that's exactly what you see. The bees sequentially take off 1, 2, 3, decide, okay, rejected, 1, 2, 3, rejected. And you can see that they're hovering extensively in front of the 2 dotted patterns, even though that bee has never viewed purple dot arrangements before, but they find the correct number in this particular case. So just a brief overview of the beauty of a miniature brain of a bee. So here's a frontal view of a bee's head. These structures shaded in blue are the lamina, medulla, and lobula. They're visual ganglia that analyze information from the eyes. This sort of old-fashioned telephone dial arrangement is the antennal lobe, the first olfactory relay. Both of these areas, the visual lobes and the antennal lobes, project to the so-called mushroom bodies, which are dorsal structures responsible for multisensory integration and learning and memory. The total number of neurons in honeybees is under 1 million, and bumblebees closer to 1 million. So they are small brains with relatively few numbers, but how many do you actually need for tasks like counting? So here's a study by Vera Vazas in which she basically designed a model based on the kinds of neurons that we find in the lobula, and finds that for a simple counting task where you sequentially take off, so this counting is not like the subitizing that you know in humans where you look at a dice and you can see at a glance there's 4, 5, or 6 dots. Bees always tick them off sequentially. And for this kind of sequential counting task, to count to 3 or 4, you need a 4-neuron network. That's all you need. It looks clever, perhaps because of all the clever things that we can do with numbers, but in neurocomputational terms, it is not actually that advanced. And I'll come back to that later in various other contexts. So this takes us to a question of whether bees actually need to store images of flowers. They clearly recognize them. They find species of a particular flower and then reliably return to them, again, often scanning over the patterns in the same way as you've seen with the number pattern. But do they actually have mental representations? Do they store an image in their little heads, or can they get by with something much simpler? And one possibility of how to do something much simpler is to simply use known feature detector neurons in the insect lobula, the third optical ganglion. And the lobula, this third optical ganglion, has many of the neuron types that we have in our area V1, including edge detectors that can, in some cases, recognize edge orientation irrespective of where they are in the visual field. So here's a wide field neuron from Wolfiller-Gronenberg's team in the lobula. Just notice the complexity of just one single nerve cell. So you imagine you have 1 million of these. You get a wiring diagram that can be fairly complex still. And so here's one of these, the angle response profile of one of these edge detector neurons. And so what we did is, because unlike the fly people who now have a complete connectome, we don't yet know all of the connections in the visual system. So we built models that are not tweaked to mimic any empirically determined pattern discrimination abilities, because if you tweak your model and then it gives you something that matches reality, well then that's because you've tweaked your model. It's not because the model is actually meaningful. So what we did is, without any kind of input from behavior or pattern discrimination experiments, we wired up the lamina, medulla, and lobula in various plausible ways, multiple different models, in turn connected them with a modeled mushroom body, and explored how good these various models are at discriminating various patterns. So here are some of the pattern discrimination experiments that we and others, in this case, this is a study by Xiao Zhang and Adrian Horridge, how good bees really are, that's the behavioral result on the x-axis, at discriminating these patterns, and how good the models are. Each type of color of dot here is a subtly different way of wiring up the lamina with medulla, lobula, and the mushroom bodies. Now, many modelers would pride themselves in seeing all the dots on a line, right? So they would say, okay, now I've got a great model because it exactly predicts the behavior that I'm seeing. And that's what you get if you tweak your model to replicate empirical results. But that's not what we find with our models, of which no parameter was tweaked to mimic empirical results. What we find instead is that these extremely simple models that are just based on 4 edge detector neurons, however we wire them up with the mushroom bodies, the models are better than the real bees for whatever models we use. So every color here is a different, subtly different wiring diagram. But the point there is that with simple 4 feature detectors for all of these pattern discriminations, you get better results than the real bees. And bear in mind that these models are so simple as to be caricatures of the processing capacities in the visual system of the bee, yet they do very well at all of these patterns. So quite clearly then, you do not need to store whole images of all of these patterns. You can get by with very simple edge detectors for even complex pattern recognition. And of course, a different way to ask this question of how much neural circuitry do you need for ability X? Often you will find studies where they're linking brain size to something that looks clever. Brain size is absolutely irrelevant if you don't have an idea of how, at a computational level, you can actually, how many neurons you need to mediate task X. And to just come back to our earlier face recognition experiment, so here we have a number of, we're reducing and reducing and reducing the number of required lobular neurons for simple discrimination such as plus signs and X's, but also these face recognition tasks. And you can easily do it with just 36 feature detectors. The performance collapses for 16 and 4, whereas with 16 neurons you still get by discriminating X's and plus signs. So the number of neurons actually required to recognize even complex patterns is diminutively small, and often surprisingly so. And that, of course, raises the slightly worrying question of whether bee vision is actually like blind sight. Blind sight in humans is the phenomenon that people with damage to area V1 are for all practical purposes, blind. They can't verbally inform you of what they're seeing. But if you're asking them to guess what's the color of this flower, or what's the orientation of a bar, they will first respond, well, I'm blind, I can't possibly tell you. And if you then prod them and say, well, just guess, they'll still often get it correctly. And that, of course, in theory at least, could be the same with bees. They might not actually see images. So here is an image from an under review article with some Italian friends who work on blindsight in primates. So here's a task that, for example, a blindsighted patient fails at. So they can recognize vertical bars and horizontal bars, but if you're asked to integrate them, these simple efferent shapes, they will fail to discriminate these kinds of shapes. For bees, that hasn't been done yet in a directly comparable way, but you've seen some of the patterns that they can discriminate. They're by far more complex. We also don't know if, so we do know that bees can discriminate numbers irrespective of arrangements and shapes and so on. We don't know that for blindsighted patients, but we do know that they fail at anything that involves visual memory. Okay? So there is a whole realm of pattern discrimination abilities, memories, including working memory and delayed matching to sample tasks, where blindsighted people would fail, but bees would not. Now, you could say they have a much more complicated blind sight and still don't see patterns, but the evidence is pointing in the opposite direction. But one better way of testing whether indeed there is a kind of mental representation of object properties is to simply look in a different sensory modality. And so what we've done here is we've trained bees on a very simple shape recognition tasks where you have to distinguish cubes from balls. In this case, one group of bees is trained to collect sugar rewards from balls, not cubes. And you then ask them, can you now recognize the same shape in complete darkness, so under infrared light, using your tactile sense alone? So in this case, the sensory input, of course, is entirely different. There are completely different sensors involved from the periphery. They're differently temporally, they're differently structured, and so on. So this is a bit like the good old-fashioned birthday party game for kiddies, where you're either blindfolded or you reach into a bag while not seeing what you're feeling, and you have to retrieve a coin, a spoon, a screwdriver, or a key by touch alone, an object that you've previously only seen. And that, of course, requires you to, at some level, picture the shape in your mind. You can't use it using the same sensory modality. And indeed, it turns out that bees trained on this look but don't touch scenario, so that the objects are under a plexiglass lid, they can see them but not touch them, will subsequently, in case they're trained to balls, prefer these ball-shaped things if they can actually hug them. And you can do the same in the opposite direction, where we're training bees in darkness using their tactile sense alone. So this bee in this group has been trained to get its sugar water on a cube. And we subsequently test them under light. And you can see now, again, the object can't be touched, just viewed. And she inspects the ball, rejects it, and in this case returns back to the cube. So in both directions, they can pass the cross-modal recognition task very well, at least indicating that there is something more than just a storing of simple sensory input. Now, one reason that we're so interested in these object manipulation tasks, of which I've shown you some yesterday, is that to my mind they actually have a bearing on awareness. So Washburn, over a century ago, said this. Think, for example, of a creature able to respond to its environment, but not able to alter the relative position of different features of that environment. Objects for such an animal simply would not exist. There would be a vague background of sensation qualities, but no sharply defined groups of such qualities. An object to the human mind is essentially a bit of experience with which things can be done. And that, of course, is why we're so interested in these kinds of tasks, like the string pulling task, where the bee has to pull on a string to get access to a reward, a sugar water droplet in the center of the flower. Yesterday, someone asked me whether there's any kind of information on means-end comprehension. We're working on it, so this is work in progress, where we're testing bees with two options, where you either have to pull on a longer, or you choose the longer string, or you're tricked into picking the shorter string, which, however, is interrupted. Very few animals can do this. Bees can do it spontaneously quite well, also with such diagonal strings, where again there's one deceptively short string but with an interruption, and a diagonal string that is actually doing the job. This bee is a bit flighty, so she tries the diagonal string several times and then gives up, but ultimately I think she finds one of which she pulls out altogether. Now, the problem there is with this investigation, as far as it's published, is of course that these bees have previous experience with pulling connected strings. So there is a chance that they've simply memorized the lollipop shape of the complete object and then transferred that. So we're now experimenting with magnetic flowers that we can pull from underneath the table, and bees are trained to recognize that interrupted strings work. And it looks as if even if they're trained with interrupted strings, if they're then given a choice later on, they still choose the continuous ones, but watch this space. Now, some people yesterday have mentioned play behavior. So in the course of our study where we trained bees to roll balls to a particular destination, we also found that some bees will roll balls around even when there's never a reward, when there's no appetitive reward whatsoever. And Samadhi Gapayage then turned this into her PhD study, asking if bees actually enjoy the ball rolling in itself. And it turned out that so she had these playgrounds where there was never any appetitive reward offered, where bees actually had to make detours to get to them. Food was offered plentifully somewhere else. Yet bees returned again and again to these areas, and even with increased frequency after already experiencing that there's no reward available, no food reward. So that the indication was indeed that the reward was the activity in itself. And that, of course, takes me to the perhaps most controversial question of whether, if they're enjoying these kinds of activities, do bees have emotions? And we don't know this any more, of course, than in any other non-language gifted animals. And indeed, 20, 30 years ago, I and most of my colleagues would have thought the question to be ridiculous. And one study that changed my mind a little bit on this topic was one where we asked, now nearly 20 years ago, whether bees can learn about predation threat. And so they're not just rewarding things in a bee's environment, they're also predators to look out for. And one such predator is the crab spider. So there are various crab spider species that can actually change color, like a chameleon, only slower, and take on the color of the flowers on which they prey. They're sit-and-wait predators that don't build large webs, but actually just lurk on flowers waiting for unassuming bees or other pollinators to land there. And we took this situation into the laboratory building these artificial crab spiders. Well, we call them robotic spiders, where bees could be briefly captured and then released in a kind of simulated predator attempt, and that's shown in this video. So this bee lands on a safe flower and nothing happens, and now she makes a mistake. So that sounds gruesome, but these are very soft sponges, okay? So there's no physical injury at all. So that's the simulated predator attack, as often happens in nature, by the way. So often bees are strong flyers, and they also have stingers. So they often do escape, not always, but they sometimes do escape. So there is opportunity for learning. And so this is the situation here, as we've just seen it. So the bees land on safe flowers and get fed there. Whenever they land on a flower with an artificial spider on it, they get captured. And after some such experiences, they indeed learn to avoid the predator-infested flowers, but their whole demeanor changes. So they fly quite a bit more slowly. They inspect and scan every flower before landing on it. But the surprising result that we hadn't expected was that in the bees with this experience, there were lots of false alarms. That is, they would scan a perfectly safe flower and then reject it, as if they'd seen a ghost. And I'm deliberately anthropomorphically speaking here, but this did look a little bit like a post-traumatic stress disorder, where you're conjuring up a threat just from memory, not from a current experience. This was not a formal study to explore an emotion-like state, just one that prompted me and others in the team to scratch our heads a little bit and explore it further. Now, how might one more formally test animal emotions? So here's a test that is actually borrowed from work that people have done on rodents and on various domestic animals, sheep, goats, and so on, to explore whether they're kept in conditions conducive to their well-being or not, as the case may be. It's a version of in humans, the proverbial glass that is either half full or half empty. So there's an ambiguous stimulus, a glass filled to the middle, and you're asking, well, in the human case, the positively disposed person, the optimist, will say, well, that's pretty good, there's still plenty in there, whereas the same stimulus might be viewed by a pessimistic mindset as, oh, it's almost all gone. And be all sad about it. And so that's the test. We're first training bees, for example, in one group that blue is good, green is bad. So blue, there's always a reward on the left, green on the right. So this is a no-go, no-go task. There's only ever one stimulus present. And after they've learned that blue on the left is good and green on the right, there's never a reward, we're then asking them, how do you respond to the ambiguous stimulus, the one in the middle? So what you see after some training is that bees, when faced with blue on the left, they know it's good. So without hesitation, they'll fly straight there. If they're given green on the right, they'll faff about forever. They will eventually accept it, but only after minutes of delay, typically. So they'll scan around, they'll wait, maybe they're offering something else. In the end, if there really isn't anything else, they might then, oh, okay, well, if you're not offering me anything else, I might as well try this, but only after a very long delay. The question then is, what happens with an ambiguous stimulus? So this is our glass 50% filled. It's the stimulus that's ambiguous exactly in the middle. How do they respond to that? And it turns out that this depends, how they respond to the ambiguous stimulus depends on what happened before the test. And if we give them a little surprise reward, a tiny drop of sugar water before the test where they hadn't expected it, their behavior to the ambiguous stimulus changes. And so this is what you can see on the right here. So the positive stimulus on the left, blue on the left, is always responded to with minimum delay. They fly straight there. Here's green on the right, so the negative stimulus on average takes about 100 seconds before they accept it. In between here, we have the various ambiguous stimuli, so medium is the turquoise stimulus. Let's first look at the black curve. That's the one where there's no surprise reward, and the ambiguous stimulus is basically treated like the negative stimulus. However, for all the ambiguous stimuli in the middle, that's the red curve, when there was a surprise reward, all these novel ambiguous stimuli are responded to with a shorter delay than they otherwise would. So it turns out that this response to the ambiguous stimuli is also dopamine mediated, as it is in us. So they get a little dopamine hit from this surprise reward and thus respond more swiftly to the intermediate, the ambiguous stimuli. And Jerry Wright at Oxford has done the opposite experiment, where she subjected bees to surprise predator attacks or simulations of their own, and found that the entire curve then shifts in the opposite direction. So ambiguous stimuli are now treated with greater reservation. So just to conclude, we don't actually understand the computational underpinnings of these abilities, but I think an important message here is insect brains are not simple, but all the intelligent behaviors that we can model are computationally very simple. So here's a fly-through of neurons in the neck from the fly connectome people, so they have kindly lent me this video just for you to appreciate. This is a fly brain. Bees are far more complex. Just the complexity of the insect connectome in something as simple as a fruit fly. Each single nerve cell here can make up to 10,000 connections with other nerve cells, so that for bees at least, you still have a wiring diagram that's way outside the reach of what we can understand comprehensively. And this stunning complexity of bee brains, of course, was recognized quite early on by Ramon y Cajal, who didn't just explore mammalian brains, but also insects. And this is what he said. The excellence of the psychic machine does not increase with zoological hierarchy. Instead, one realizes that in fish and amphibians, the nervous centers have undergone an unexpected simplification. Of course, their gray matter has increased considerably in mass, but when the structure of their brains is compared with that of bees or dragonflies, they're excessively plain, coarse, and rudimentary. Sorry, zebrafish people, if there are any. It is as if one were to pretend to hold as equals the merits of a rough grandfather clock with the quality of a fine pocket watch, a marvel of fineness, delicacy, and precision. As always, in building her marvelous works, nature distinguishes herself much more in her tiny creations than in the large. This here, by the way, is a drawing by Ramon y Cajal of the honeybee visual system, including beautifully detailed drawings of identified neurons in the lamella, medulla, and the lobula, or V1 area in the insects. It's fantastic just how detailed and how accurate these drawings are. So just to wrap up, so I think there is at least suggestive evidence for mental representations of space, of things, and of number. There is at least a possibility of emotion-like states by the same criteria that the vertebrate crowd typically uses, so we're not lowering the bar. And these are at least key ingredients of minds, so far as I'm concerned. So I think we are thinking and feeling and enjoying and suffering beings, likely surrounded by lots of other thinking and feeling and suffering and enjoying beings, however different their minds might be. Many of the computational recognition abilities, like face recognition, counting, and so on, can be implemented with exceedingly small neuron numbers. So our big mystery, to my mind, is not how bees get by with such small brains, but why do they need brains as big as they really are? There's also a book about all this stuff if you've enjoyed this, but I'll stop now, and I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you very much.